The Pacific has been out for just about 2 weeks now, and it's about time we start talking about the weapons that came with this massive update, as well as, more interestingly, what weapons are still to come. So in today's video, we'll cover the Pacific weapons already in the game, those announced as coming as part of Chapter 5, and those possibly rumored to find their way onto the battlefield sometime soon. I'll include timestamps to the individual weapons down below in the description if you're interested, but without further ado, let's jump into the weapons expected as part of Chapter 5, but not yet here, alongside their history and data mined release dates. Starting off with the M1918A2, or more commonly known as the BAR, Browning Automatic Rifle. This is a weapon that, in its original M1918 variant, many Battlefield 1 players will be all too familiar with. Now, the A2 variant is only really a small further development in the weapon's history, and thus isn't too different, and therefore you can expect it to perform relatively similar. In terms of the original and its possibilities and capabilities, it had a fire rate of up to 650 rounds per minute, a detachable box magazine of either 20 or 40 bullets, and thus likely in terms of in-game performance will be very similar to something like the FG42. The release date of this weapon, as all of the release dates in today's video, is of course of origins from data miners, specifically the relatively reputable Temporal, and while he generally gets things right, as shown with, for example, Chapter 4, DICE does sometimes go in and actually change the release dates or even the rewards for certain weekly missions, and thus absolutely take these release dates with a grain of salt. As to the M19A2, however, it is scheduled to be the unlock reward for the Week 7 challenge of Chapter 5, and that challenge begins on December the 12th. Following up from that, the next weekly weapon reward supposedly is in Week 10, or in January the 2nd, and is the Nambu Type 2A SMG for the medic. This is probably actually a reference to the Nambu Type 1 or Type 2 SMG, as I wasn't really able to find any reference to an actual Type 2A SMG. This was a relatively experimental SMG developed by the Japanese for the Second World War that never saw any major combat action, with a couple of minor exceptions, but in terms of its performance, supposedly had a fire rate of 500 rounds per minute, and the only difference, by the way, between the Type 1 and Type 2 versions of the weapon were supposedly improvements to the ergonomic design of the Type 2 over the Type 1. Given that this is a relatively slow firing SMG, probably DICE is going to implement it as a very much more accurate medium long range focused SMG, but that isn't to say that they won't take any liberties with the weapon, as DICE has in the past, for balance reasons, decided to change the way weapons work or function in their in-game variants to make for a more balanced and engaging experience. Moving on to Week 11 of Chapter 5 then, January the 9th, supposedly we will be getting the Type 97 LMG. Now, in reality, the Type 97 was actually a heavy tank machine gun used by the Japanese in World War II, but in all fairness, it was based on the design of the Czech ZBVZ-26, which was actually a light machine gun the Japanese captured many of when fighting China's National Revolutionary Army, and thus it's not completely unrealistic to see them implement it as an LMG. It's also worth noting in terms of the weight of the weapon, it's pretty much just as heavy as the Lewis gun is, and well, we have that as LMG in Battlefield 5 as well. Originally, the weapon actually featured a 20-round box magazine and a fire rate of about 500 rounds per minute. Thus, unless DICE decides to in any way change the actual performance of the weapon in game, we're likely looking at competition for the Madsen MG and the Bren gun, which already pretty much dominate the long-range LMG space with their 514 round per minute fire rates. In Week 12 then, the last of the actual Chapter 5 weekly assignments, starting on January the 16th, we should be getting the M3 Grease Gun. Of course, an iconic American SMG intended to actually replace the Thompson in World War II, but in reality actually only saw relatively limited usage and never really fully replaced the Thompson due to some delays in actual production. It was, however, mainly used in the Korean War subsequently, so saw a fair bit of combat. We don't have the stats for the actual weapon in-game just yet. However, in reality, it fired a relatively meager 450 rounds per minute, and thus, unless it gets a massive buff or massive change from its original performance, will be competition for the slowest firing, long-range focused SMGs, such as, for example, the ZK3A3, without its faster fire rate specialization. Before we move on to the weapons that actually are in the game as of now, it's worth noting that there are a series of weapons that make sense to be introduced as part of Chapter 5 or a later American expansion, but currently aren't officially announced. Specifically, for example, the Itacha 37 pump action shotgun, which was admittedly largely used for hunting and not warfare, and the M2 Carbine, which was essentially a select fire, and thus fully automatically capable, variant of the M1 Garand. Both of these were shown off in the Chapter 4 trailer, and supposedly part of the release of the competitive 5v5 mode, which was of course cancelled, and thus we cannot say for certain when or if at all we will be getting these weapons. I personally think we'll most likely see them in a later chapter, say chapter 6 or 7, when the Americans go up against the Germans back over in Europe. That would also make a little bit more sense with when the actual M1 Garand was used, because it was used towards the end of the actual Second World War, and then even only in relatively limited numbers. Further then, we have the M1A1 Thompson, which I should note is very different from the M1928 Tommy gun that we currently have in Battlefield 5, one of them being a more civilian version, whereas the M1A1 Thompson was the military variant and had a series of differentiating factors. It's worth noting here that this weapon hasn't been confirmed to be coming as part of Chapter 5 or even at all, but simply acknowledged by one of the community managers, Jeff Brannock, to be a fan favorite request set to possibly or maybe come at a later date. Once more likely we're looking here at a Chapter 6 or 7 release instead of part of Chapter 5. With the weapons not yet in the game, however, then out the way, let's turn our attention to weapons that are actually already here, some of which won't necessarily already be available to everybody out there. Specifically, that refers to the Type 94 and Model 27 sidearms, which are part of the chapter rank unlocks at level 23 and level 30, and thus, unless you've played Battlefield 5 extensively since the release of Chapter 5 in the Pacific, or have put down quite a bit of money and got plenty of the chapter booster ranks, which essentially allow you to skip over a series of ranks, you probably won't have unlocked all or frankly any of these sidearms just yet. In terms of the Type 94, this Japanese pistol was actually adopted by the Japanese army in 1934, produced to the end of the Second World War, generally a lightweight design and thus preferred by tankers and aircraft crew, but wasn't necessarily just limited to those military personnel. In terms of its in-game performance, which we do know given that the weapon is technically of course implemented in Battlefield 5, its 449 round per minute fire rate alongside its 4-shot bullet to kill makes it relatively similar to the Repetia Pistola M1912, simply sacrificing a little bit of magazine size and muzzle velocity for a significantly faster reload than that of the M1912. Over with the Model 27, a level 30 unlock, this is actually better known as the 357 Smith & Wesson Magnum revolver, and under that name is of course relatively well known. It's actually still produced even today, of course limited to private usage. In terms of its in-game performance, we actually have some competition now for the MK6 revolver, with the Model 27 essentially sacrificing fire rate for medium range damage potential, thus with a fire rate of only 105 rounds per minute, versus the 179 of the MK6 being significantly outdamaged in close quarters, but capable of 2-shot body shot killing targets up to 30 meters instead of the meager 10 of the MK6. This better damage performance of course extends even to longer ranges, where this weapon will eventually top out at a 4-shot body shot kill instead of the 6 body shot kill of the MK6. This is pretty much going to be a fantastic addition for those that need sidearms that are capable of extending ranges more to the medium range, specifically for example the bolt action scout user, but likely if you're more of a close quarter SMG playing medic, the MK6 is going to continue to be the better choice for you. Onto the primary weapons, and not wanting to make this video excessively long, we are going to stick to the most important aspects of these when going through them. Now the Jungle Carbine, the first of the weapons we're looking at, and personally my favorite of the bunch, is actually more commonly referred to as the Rifle No. 5 MK1, and was a variant of the Lee Enfield, designed for airborne forces in Europe. Now its nickname and most of its actual in-combat usage actually came in later years of its service, in colonial campaigns, specifically in modern-day Malaysia, but nevertheless it was developed and used during World War II as well. In terms of the bare minimum stats, it has a maximum damage of 56, a minimum damage of 40, giving it a 2-shot body shot kill all the way out to 100 meters, and a 1-shot headshot kill up until 75. Its fire rate at 83 rounds per minute is very high if you compare it to a bolt action rifle, but relatively low if you compare it to a bolt action carbine. Relatively generous, however, is its magazine size at 10, and thus you can take on plenty of targets without having to reload. In terms of where this weapon fits in with the competition, specifically of course the other bolt action carbines, it is essentially the most long range variant of them, being capable of 2-shot body shot killing targets at distances far greater than the Commando Carbine or the M28 Contrambacino, and the same goes for the 1-shot headshot kills. I will actually probably be doing a full comparison on the bolt-action carbines relatively soon, where we can go into a little bit more detail on how these three weapons differentiate themselves and where the necessary strengths and weaknesses may actually lie. In terms of usage of this weapon, however, the most important section, if we're honest, of any kind of weapon overview, this is essentially a very aggressive sniper rifle. That's how it plays. It very much sits in between a bolt-action carbine and a bolt-action rifle. And thus, if you like aggressive sniping, you can now do so while also constantly healing yourself up and having access to smokes, which is an unbelievably powerful combination for pushing up on targets at more medium ranges. Positioning is important, accuracy is important, but the fact that you have both smoke and health makes you a significantly harder to kill target and massively increases your survivability, and thus you can also get pretty damn aggressive with this weapon, especially if you're comfortable with a bit of sidearm action. You can easily push up into close quarters with your Model 27 or Mark 6 revolver. Keeping with the medic class, but moving from the bolt-action carbines to the SMGs, the Type 100 is actually the main SMG that the Japanese fielded in World War II, and it was the only one that they actually produced in larger quantities themselves. In terms of their stats, it's actually relatively interesting given that its maximum damage sits at a meager 20 and its minimum damage at a meager 11, meaning that it essentially requires always one bullet more than the competing SMGs out there to take down a target. Thus, the 720 rounds per minute fire rate, while high, doesn't result in this weapon being able to keep up with, say, something like an upgraded ZK-383 or Tommy gun in close encounter combat. Now, the magazine size at 30 is relatively standard, reload times are good, recoil on the other hand is extraordinarily low, with 0.4 vertical and more importantly, record low 0.08 to the left and right in terms of its horizontal recoil. When talking about the Type 100, what is important is to understand it relative to the competition out there. And there, in terms of its actual damage model, it's going to compare more in close quarters to something like an MAB-38, which has of course a fire rate of 599 rounds per minute and the usual 4-shot kill in close quarters. And at longer ranges, it likely compares with some of the best out there, specifically the MP-34 with a fire rate increase upgrade, which of course gives that weapon, again, a 599 round per minute fire rate, but actually a lower bullet to kill than any of the other SMGs out there. That's how powerful this weapon is, alongside extraordinarily low recoil. It's a little bit difficult to compare, but nevertheless, this is most definitely, in terms of its usage case, one of the most flexible weapons out there. If equipped with specializations focusing, for example, on hipfire, you can have a very capable close-quarter hipfire SMG that even at medium ranges then, once ADS'd, will be very capable thanks to the extraordinarily low recoil. Moving from the medic to the support then, we have the M1919A6, or far more commonly known as the Browning machine gun. This weapon doesn't need much introducing. It served as the general purpose machine gun for the US Army in the Second World War and the Korean War, and adapted versions of it even saw usage during the Vietnam War. The A6 version, however, is actually developed to be operated by an individual soldier, unlike many of the other variants out there that usually require 2 to 4 soldiers to actually operate. And while this weapon is still at 15 kilos extremely heavy, it's thus not completely unrealistic that we have this as usable MMG for one soldier in Battlefield 5. In terms of the stats, they're relatively easily summarized as standard damage model, standard bullet to kill, relatively low fire rate for the class at 599 rounds per minute, ridiculously large magazine size at 250, and for an MMG, relatively low recoil. Which means, in terms of how this weapon compares to the competition, well, frankly, it doesn't, because there aren't MMGs out there that really compare, both in terms of low recoil, in terms of their thus consequential accuracy, and long-range capability. If you want to go prone or even crouched using an MMG but be able to extend your engagement distance from medium long to pretty much wherever you want to shoot, this is the weapon for you. You won't be out damaging anybody in close quarters, but you will be lasering people across the entire map. Moving from the support to the assault, we got of course the iconic M1 Garand, which was actually the standard US service rifle between 1936 and 1959, serving in World War II, the Korean War, and even to a limited degree during Vietnam. It's actually still used by the US today, specifically only of course for drill teams and military honor guards, but that is most definitely a testament to not only how iconic this weapon is, but how advanced it was for its time. Most of course will recognize it from its iconic pinging sound, which is actually made by ejecting the N-block clip of the weapon when reloading it. In terms of stats, things here are very comparable to something like the Turner SMLE or MAS 44, with a maximum damage of 40 and a minimum damage of 30, guaranteeing it a 3-shot body shot kill up until 50 meters with a 4-shot kill from that point onwards. Your fire rate is high at 359 rounds per minute, and your magazine is relatively low at only 8 rounds available. What's really interesting about the M1 Garand is that A, it has relatively low recoil for the class, and while slightly hampered by its magazine size, easily outperforms both the Mass and the Turner SMLE in terms of simply lower horizontal and lower vertical recoil. And secondly, in terms of the specialization options, you can make this perform very much like a Gewehr 43 with an all-range 3-shot kill at 300 rounds per minute for a fire rate. Even then, it still has a significantly lower recoil model to the competing Gewehr 43, and thus if you're struggling a little bit with recoil with any of the semi-autos, but specifically the Turner SMLE, Mass 44 or Gewehr 43, likely the M1 Garand is the perfect weapon for you, and that it's competing with these kinds of weapons shows you just how good it is, as those are to be considered some of the best weapons currently in the game. In terms of usage, things are relatively simple for a semi-auto, given just how flexible those weapons are. A little bit of positioning and good aim will of course get you a long way, and sticking out of extreme close quarters where SMGs will simply outdamage you is also advisable, but really, other than extreme long ranges, there isn't anything you can't at least perform decently with when it comes to the M1 Garand. Then to round things off, we have the Type 99 Arisaka. Intended actually as the standard rifle for the Japanese army in World War II, it never actually managed to fully replace its predecessor, the Type 38. Nevertheless, this was a relatively successful rifle. In terms of its damage output, it maxes out at 75 body shot damage and has a minimum of 60, it has a magazine size of 5 and a fire rate at 58 rounds per minute, paired with a decent muzzle velocity at 600 meters per second. Really, this weapon is just kind of your average of the mill, medium to medium long range focused bolt action rifle, with muzzle velocity performance identical to the likes of the Ross rifle or the Gewehr M1919A6 and a damage drop-off that compares to those two weapons relatively favorably as well. This is no long-range focused Kar 98, it's no close quarter focused or multi-target approach Lee Enfield, but something in between the two. Thus, if you're any good at sniping, you're likely going to enjoy this weapon. What I will say is that the Arisaka actually comes with a fantastic 3x magnification scope that does lend itself very well to more aggressive sniping, and thus maybe you do consider this one of the more slightly aggressive focused recon weapons available in the bolt action category. But that pretty much wraps it up for the Pacific weapons in Battlefield 5. Feel free to share your own experiences with them down below. If you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated. And with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 5 video.